Deep behind the walls of the Alabama Department of Corrections lies a system where men die at rates 5 times higher than the state average, where overcrowding, violence, and neglect are not anomalies but routine. This is America's most dangerous prison system. The anatomy of a crisis. The gaunt perimeter fences, the iron bars, the pale corridor lights, all these are familiar images of incarceration. But it is what hides behind them in Alabama that shocks. Inside the state's prison system, a crisis has been decades in the making, yet few outside have seen it up close. To understand how the system collapsed, we must start at the beginning, with the architecture of failure. The Alabama Department of Corrections, ADOC, oversees a network of men's prisons whose mortality and violence statistics are among the worst in the nation. The federal government identified the system as constitutionally deficient. In 2019, a report pronounced that Alabama's prison system violated the Eighth Amendment because of its failure to protect inmates from severe, violent conditions. PrisonLegalNews.org. Overcrowding is one of the clearest symptoms. In 2021, the system held about 18,300 inmates, shrinking from earlier highs, yet by 2024 the total approached 21,000. Alabama Reflector simulations estimated that by 2030 the inmate population could grow by 1/3 or more, reaching up to 28,000. Corrections 1. When you cram more bodies into space than it was designed for, systems fray. Guards are fewer, supervision relaxes, and violence becomes inevitable. Understaffing amplifies this danger. At one facility, the ratio was reportedly only 11 security staff on a shift for 800 prisoners. KEDM, that means frightened men in cells, minimal oversight, and opportunity for everything from illicit trade to lethal violence. The mortality rates paint the darkest picture. One oversight committee documented that over 45% of deaths inside the system in a recent year were due to homicide, suicide, or fatal overdoses. BirminghamFreePress.com, drug use, easily smuggled contraband, and weak medical care create a lethal toxic loop. Overdoses are soaring. Suicides are doubling. The Marshall Project. Infrastructure doesn't help. Many prisons were built decades ago, never meant for the number of men who now occupy them. Plumbing fails, ventilation is inadequate, and maintenance budgets are chronically underfunded. The result: wings where the air is thick, the tension palpable, and escape from violence scant. And so we arrive at the paradox. The state calls them prisons for correction, but in reality these institutions are warehouses of crisis. Men enter, often for long sentences, and then live their days in an environment where survival is the first objective, not rehabilitation. But the crisis is not just about numbers. It's about human lives. The story of one facility, one housing unit, one shift tells us more than statistics ever can. For example, near the towns of Elmore and Wetumpka lie clusters of state prisons where violence has become normalized. The Alabama Department of Corrections' own records note multiple inmate deaths from freshly sharpened weapons, stabbings, and assaults. One facility, Elmore Correctional Facility, recorded several fatal stabbings in 1 year alone despite being rated medium security. Wikipedia. The cycle of violence feeds other failures. When medical care is delayed or smothered by budget cuts, an inmate falls ill. When a guard is missing, or a shift understaffed, a cell door stays unlocked longer. When weapons proliferate, so do deaths. The narrative is chillingly consistent. The system is broken and the state has known it for years. And yet, in many public statements, state officials insist that building new megaprisons and tougher sentencing will solve the issue. But if you fix the building and ignore the staffing, the culture, the healthcare, you simply get a newer warehouse for suffering. As one advocate put it, you don't stop the crisis by building walls. You stop it by valuing lives inside them. This chapter sets the stage. We have seen the skeleton of the crisis. But in the coming chapters we will meet the men inside, the deaths that could have been prevented, the smuggled footage that reveals secrets, and the urgent question: does justice in Alabama mean survival or suffering? As the light begins to fade in the corridors of the forgotten, the crisis remains alive, not just as a broken building, but as a moral stain on our system of corrections. Voices from the shadows, inmates inside the system. If the walls of Alabama's prisons could speak, they wouldn't whisper, they'd scream. Inside the St. Clair Correctional Facility, The soundscape isn't silence but chaos. Metal scraping on concrete, shouts echoing through narrow halls, the distant clang of steel doors slamming shut. For many of the men inside, each day is a gamble, between surviving another 24 hours or becoming the next body bag rolled out before sunrise. In 2020, the U.S. Department of Justice released a scathing 56-page report on Alabama's prisons for men, concluding that the system was riddled with violence so pervasive that it violates the Constitution. DOJ Report, 2020. It wasn't an exaggeration. Between 2019 and 2023, dozens of inmates were murdered, many in broad daylight, sometimes with homemade weapons fashioned from broom handles or broken bed frames. Others were found hanging in their cells, the result of unchecked mental illness, neglect, or despair. One inmate described it bluntly in an interview with the Marshall Project. "You don't have to be in a gang to die here. You just have to be in the way." Take the story of Michael Smith, a 28-year-old serving time at Ventress Correctional Facility for a non-violent offense. In 2023, Smith was found unresponsive in his cell after a night of fights that broke out across multiple dorms. The coroner's report listed blunt force trauma to the head. The prison called it an incident. His family called it murder. Or Charles C.J. Johnson, who spoke with AL.com before his release from Limestone Correctional. He described sleeping with one eye open, because the correctional officers were often too few, sometimes only 3 to supervise hundreds of men. "If something happens, you're on your own," he said. "By the time help comes, somebody's already bleeding out." That's not hyperbole. At Limestone in 2022, 2 men died from stabbing wounds during the same shift. No officer witnessed the assaults, they were discovered hours later during routine counts. These aren't isolated tragedies. They form a mosaic of systemic collapse. The DOJ's findings listed rampant, unlawful use of force by staff, easy access to weapons, sexual assault, and unchecked gang control. Justice.gov. One former inmate, who requested anonymity, smuggled a contraband phone and posted footage to social media. Videos showing open drug use, beatings, and men passed out on cell floors. The clips went viral, forcing the ADOC to launch an internal investigation. The state's response? Confiscate phones, rather than fix the causes of the violence they revealed. But behind those images lies another truth: the silence. Many inmates refuse to speak for fear of retaliation, not only from other prisoners but from staff. The Alabama prison culture has long operated under an inmate versus officer code that leaves no room for trust. Those who file grievances often find themselves moved into isolation or placed in the same dorms as their attackers. Mental health is another battlefield. According to federal oversight filings, more than 1 in 4 Alabama prisoners suffers from a serious mental illness. Montgomery Advertiser, 2022. Yet there are fewer than 100 licensed counselors for the entire system. Suicide watch units are often overfilled, forcing inmates to sleep on floors or in shower stalls. Guards have been caught falsifying logs meant to check on suicidal prisoners. In one case documented by the Birmingham News, an inmate was found dead in his segregation cell. The officer on duty had marked "alive" checks every 30 minutes for 6 hours. Violence, drugs, corruption, these are the headlines. But beneath them is something deeper: neglect so systemic that suffering has become normalized. Inside, even the smallest privileges, soap, toothpaste, a clean uniform, become currency. Those with money or connections get protection. Those without live by luck. And then there are the gangs, groups like the Gangster Disciples, the Bloods, and local factions like the 135s. According to internal DOC incident reports leaked in 2023, entire dorms were effectively controlled by inmate gangs who handled their own enforcement, discipline, and contraband distribution. Correctional officers rarely intervened unless the violence spilled into the hallways. But even among chaos, there are flickers of humanity. A lifer named Ray, locked up since 1989, runs an informal literacy class for younger men. He teaches them to read using old Bible pages and scraps of paper. "We've been abandoned by the state," he says. "So we teach each other how not to disappear." In another dorm at Bullock Correctional, inmates run a faith-based program to counsel those at risk of suicide, something the administration quietly tolerates because they know the alternative is worse. These are voices from the shadows, men who know the system's failures not as headlines but as daily reality. They speak softly, not because they're afraid, but because in Alabama's prisons, the walls themselves are always listening. And so the question grows louder. When a prison becomes more dangerous than the streets that sent men there, who is really being punished? The guards, the gangs, and the state. Corruption inside the walls. Every prison has rules. In Alabama, the first rule is survival, and everyone, from inmates to officers, plays the game to stay alive. When you enter a facility like St. Clair Correctional, it's hard to tell who really runs it. Officially, the state says the Alabama Department of Corrections maintains control. Unofficially, the gangs, the contraband, and the corruption decide everything. Over the past decade, the line between guard and gangster has blurred so thin that sometimes they're the same person. The Department of Justice's 2020 report didn't just highlight inmate violence, it also cited widespread corruption among correctional officers, including smuggling weapons, drugs, and phones into prisons for cash. Justice.gov, 2020. And the evidence keeps coming. In 2023, the U.S. Attorney's Office charged an Alabama corrections officer with distributing methamphetamine and fentanyl inside Staten Correctional Facility. The drugs had been hidden in food containers and brought in during night shifts. AL.com, 2023. That same year, another officer was caught on camera accepting a $5,000 bribe to deliver contraband phones and SIM cards to inmates in Limestone Correctional Facility. Phones are gold behind bars. They connect inmates to the outside world, but they also fuel criminal enterprises. One investigator described it bluntly. Every phone is a portal, a way to traffic drugs, coordinate hits, extort families, or run scams across state lines. Contraband phones have become so common that the ADOC now uses cell phone detection towers near facilities to intercept signals. Yet even with millions spent on countermeasures, the phones keep coming in, because the demand is endless, and the suppliers are often wearing the same uniform as the guards. But why do officers risk everything? The answer is brutally simple: money and despair. Alabama's correctional officers are among the lowest paid in the country. Starting salaries for some positions hover around $36,000 per year, according to the state's fiscal report. Combine that with dangerous working conditions, chronic understaffing, and mandatory overtime, and you have a workforce stretched thin and desperate. Former officers describe shifts where 2 guards oversaw dorms of 200 men, armed with nothing but radios. "You make $18 an hour," one ex-officer said. "A guy offers you $1,000 to walk in a package? You don't think long. You just don't." This environment breeds corruption like heat breeds decay. And once it starts, it spreads fast. In 2022, the Montgomery Advertiser published leaked emails showing that ADOC leadership had long been aware of smuggling rings within multiple facilities, but few were prosecuted. Some internal investigations were quietly closed, others reassigned. The message was clear: don't make waves. Even honest officers face retaliation. A whistleblower at Donaldson Correctional Facility told the Birmingham Watch that after reporting a fellow officer for smuggling drugs, he was transferred, isolated, and eventually forced out of his job. You're expected to look the other way. If you don't, you're the problem. For the inmates, this culture of corruption changes the rules of survival. Gangs with money and connections thrive. They pay off guards, control phones, and monopolize contraband. Others, the poor, the unconnected, are left to navigate a system that feels like a medieval hierarchy. In some dorms, gangs run what they call taxing systems, charging protection fees from weaker inmates, paid in phone minutes, commissary, or favors. Officers sometimes ignore the extortion if it keeps the peace. In 2021, leaked footage from St. Clair Correctional showed inmates openly brandishing knives while shouting threats across tiers. No guards intervened. The video went viral, forcing a brief lockdown, but inside sources said nothing changed after the cameras left. The corruption isn't just economic, it's cultural. Within the Alabama prison system, violence is seen as routine. Beatings are not always punishment but deterrent. Multiple lawsuits have documented excessive force by officers, including beatings after inmates were restrained, and even fatal assaults. The DOJ called the pattern an institutional failure of accountability. In 2019, Stephen Davis, a 40-year-old inmate at Limestone Correctional, was beaten by correctional staff during a cell extraction. He died 2 days later. The coroner listed blunt force injuries to the head. No officers were criminally charged. AL.com, 2019. When accountability fails, impunity thrives. And that's the real engine of corruption, not greed, but the absence of consequence. Even Alabama's own governor, Kay Ivey, acknowledged that the state's prisons are not sustainable in their current condition. Yet, instead of reforming from within, the state announced plans for 2 new $1 billion mega prisons, promising technology, better design, and safer conditions. Critics called it a bandage on a bullet wound. Because new walls can't fix old systems. A prison guard who spent 12 years inside put it best. You can build a new cage, but the rot follows you inside. The Alabama prison crisis isn't just a story about overcrowded buildings, it's about the collapse of integrity from the top down. From wardens to rookies, from politicians to prisoners, everyone is trapped in a web of fear, loyalty, and survival. But what happens when the violence spills over the walls? When corruption inside Alabama's prisons begins to shape life outside them? That's where the story turns next. Collapse and reckoning. When the system turns on itself. When a system designed to enforce order begins to implode, it doesn't happen in silence. It happens with riots. With fires. With the desperate echoes of men pounding on steel doors, begging for help that never comes. In 2022, Alabama's prison crisis reached a boiling point. Inmates across multiple facilities, including Holman, Donaldson, and Staten Correctional, launched coordinated work strikes and protests, refusing to cook meals, clean dorms, or process laundry. They called it a movement for basic humanity. For weeks, the inside world froze. Meals dwindled to peanut butter sandwiches, trash piled in corners, and tension became combustible. The Department of Corrections downplayed the movement, calling it minor disruptions. But images smuggled out told another story. Overcrowded dorms overflowing with men sleeping on floors, dozens of inmates sharing one toilet, and open violence while the state looked away. The movement's spark was fueled by more than conditions. It was desperation. Inmates demanded reforms to sentencing laws, parole practices, and the crumbling healthcare system. The most common chant, scrawled in letters sent to the outside, was chillingly simple. "We are dying in here." And they weren't wrong. Between 2018 and 2023, more than 350 inmates died inside Alabama's prisons, according to data compiled by the Equal Justice Initiative, EJI, and the Birmingham Free Press. Many of those deaths were preventable. Suicides, overdoses, untreated medical conditions, or unchecked violence. The Justice Department called it one of the highest per capita prison mortality rates in the United States. EJI Report, 2023. At Donaldson Correctional Facility, nicknamed the House of Pain, one inmate's letter to his family was later published online. "There are days I don't even know if I'll make it to count time. It's not about what crime you did anymore. It's about surviving the sentence, not on paper, but in blood." Even correctional staff began to break under pressure. A 2023 Montgomery Advertiser investigation revealed that officers were quitting in record numbers. Over 600 resignations in 18 months. Some cited mental health breakdowns. Others admitted fear. "It's like working in a war zone," one officer said. "You start out trying to change things. Then you just try to get home alive." The crisis grew so severe that in December 2023, the U.S. Department of Justice confirmed it would proceed to federal trial against the state of Alabama, alleging cruel and unusual punishment in violation of the Eighth Amendment. Justice.gov, 2023. It would be one of the most sweeping federal interventions in a state prison system in decades, the last of this scale since California's in 2011. But even as the courtroom battles loomed, little changed on the ground. The new megaprisons promised by the governor remained under construction, years behind schedule, and billions over budget. Meanwhile, existing facilities, some built in the 1930s, continued to decay. The Equal Justice Initiative's Brian Stevenson summarized it in one haunting statement. The absence of hope inside these prisons is the architecture of their cruelty. Alabama's prison system isn't failing, it's functioning exactly as it was built, to warehouse, not to heal. And that's the uncomfortable truth. The Alabama prison crisis isn't just an Alabama story, it's an American one. It's what happens when decades of tough-on-crime politics collide with the reality of human neglect. The state that once bragged about its law and order now faces a humanitarian emergency it can't ignore or contain. Inside the walls, the collapse continues quietly. At Holman, a small group of inmates runs a makeshift hospice unit for the dying. They clean wounds, change sheets, and pray for men whose families no longer visit. "We're all just waiting for our turn," one inmate nurse says softly. "Some of us help so we don't have to think about when our time comes." The outside world rarely sees them. But through contraband cell phones and whistleblower footage, fragments leak out, videos of rats scurrying over sleeping bodies, men calling out for insulin, broken showers running brown water. These images force a reckoning. In 2024, the New York Times published a feature titled "The Place America Forgot." It showed a haunting image: the crumbling roof of Draper Correctional Facility, sunlight piercing through cracks, illuminating empty bunks where men once slept stacked 3 high. The caption read, "Closed, but not condemned." And maybe that's the perfect metaphor. Alabama's prisons, closed, condemned, but never truly reformed. The ghosts remain, even when the walls fall. What justice looks like. So what does justice look like when the system itself becomes the crime? Maybe it looks like the mother who drives 5 hours every month just to see her son for 30 minutes through a scratched glass window. Maybe it looks like the correctional officer who risks her job to report a beating, and gets silenced for doing it. Or maybe it looks like the aging lifer, forgotten by time, still teaching others how to read because the state never cared to. The Alabama prison crisis is not a story of monsters and victims. It's a story of a system that forgot what humanity costs. And until that truth changes, every cell block remains a mirror, reflecting what America chooses not to see. As of 2025, Alabama's prison mortality rate remains one of the highest in the nation. The DOJ case continues.